World War One, the war to end all wars, which is super ironic because it directly led to World War Two, which was the greatest war this world has ever experienced, right? So what was World War One? No, this isn't the Japanese, this isn't the Holocaust, this isn't the Nazis. That was all World War Two. A lot of people don't know a ton about World War One, why it happened, or how it caused World War Two. So today, this video is just going to give a brief overview on how World War One happened and how it went, right? How it went the way it did, right? So the Great War, as it was called in the time, the war to end all wars, as we know it today, World War One, happened between 1914 and 1917, right at the beginning of the 1900s, right? It was the first global modern war, okay? It was horrific. 40 million 40 million casualties, almost 20 million of those being deaths, right? Horrible loss of life, devastation everywhere, right? Especially in Europe. These European countries were just hammered by this war. Okay. Now, it wasn't the first modern war. The first modern war was actually the American Civil War. And I have another video that discusses that. But this was the first war that modern warfare occurred between other countries. And it was awful. Now, there are four big causes, right? For long term movements, I guess you could say, that caused World War One, and we're going to discuss each of them. The first one is an industrialization. Industrialization is where you use machinery to mass produce things, right? World War One was the first industrialized war. Okay, besides Civil War, the first global industrialized war, where you had these industrialized nations using those industries to go to war with each other. Awful stuff, right? But industrialization actually improved a lot of people's lives. It shifted people's employment away from agriculture to the factory, right? People were working in factories, they were using steam to produce things on a massive scale. I mean, right now, look down in the chair you're sitting in or the bed you're laying in, look at the clothes you're wearing. It's very likely that the products you're using right now were mass produced in a factory. Okay, that allows lots of people to have access to tons of products at a very low price, relatively, right? And so this industrial revolution started mid to late 1700s, went all the way through the 1800s. And so by the time World War One started, you had these nations that were very much industrialized, right? And not only were there machines and factories, but transportation was also greatly affected by industrialization, especially the development of railroads that could transport a whole bunch of people or products across vast distances very quickly, as well as steamships to be able to go across oceans very quickly, right? Before you had to either use animal power or wind power or the currents, but now you had machines that could transport a lot of things really fast over a long distance. And that industrial revolution both facilitated and necessitated imperialism, the second big factor. Imperialism is where you have a strong country, right? Like Britain or Japan or France or Italy, right? Expanding and colonizing other parts of the world. Now, they needed to do this. Well, they didn't need to, but a big reason why they did this was because all these factories here in Britain and France and Italy needed raw materials, right? They needed iron, they needed lumber, they needed cotton or silk or whatever it was, right? And so they got these raw materials from the vast natural resource abundant places of Africa, South Asia, Australia, right? Originally, the United States was part of Britain, right? It was a British colony, But the United States, instead of colonizing it, actually, as it expanded, it actually incorporated all this land as part of the country, right? These other places, they were just colonies of the industrial nation here. And so we see how these relatively small European countries like Britain had huge amounts of land in Africa, India, Australia, Canada. And so it was sucking all these raw materials to the factories of Britain, which would then create all these finished products, right? All these good products, right? And then would sell them back to the colonies or trade them around the world, right? France did the same thing, huge chunk of Africa as well as Vietnam, right? Italy had a bit of Africa. Now all of Africa was was scrambled, right? The scramble for Africa, where all these European nations just colonized the crap out of everything, right? Even little Belgium right here had the Congo, okay? Colonies all over the place in order to provide the raw materials needed to fuel the industrialized factories up here in Europe. Now, in order to control the world, right, you need a very strong military. And so this was also contributing and needed by the Industrial Revolution, right? All these industrial nations, France, Britain, Germany, Italy, right? They needed strong militaries to be able to control all that land across the ocean. And the Industrial Revolution also made it so they could produce planes and tanks and submarines, big steamships, warboats, right? These very powerful militaries were able to be produced on a very quick, massive scale because of industrialization, because of the factories, right? And so military power grew and grew between these small European countries, right, that were being fueled by the natural resources of the rest of the world. Now, not only were those things, but things like barbed wire, machine guns, poisonous gas, horrific weapons that had never been used in combat before would come into play during the World War, right? The fourth and final long term factor that caused World War One was something called nationalization. Okay. This is where countries unite under one national identity, right? They become very patriotic. They're like, oh, we are British, we believe in Britain, or we're French and we believe in France, right? Very strong national identities, which not only made people very patriotic and wanting to be better than other countries, right? But it also was a problem, especially here in the Hungarian Austrian Empire, where there was a bunch of ethnic groups in this empire that didn't want to be part of the empire, that were very different, like the Bosnians and the Serbians, right? The Austrians, very different, very distinct cultures all under this one umbrella. And so there's a lot of turmoil in this empire, a lot of unity in these empires. And it's really interesting to look at this map. This is Europe in 1860. And you can see here, what do you notice? You have Italy and especially Germany were not unified at all. They were broken up into tons of little kingdoms and principalities, right? Not united at all. And that's why these guys didn't really do much as far as colonizing, at least compared to France and Britain. There is one figure in European history, though. We don't hardly talk about him here in the United States, but he is extremely important to understand how World War One came to be, and that is Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He was Prussian, okay, lived here in Prussia, but he was the one that united all of these little kingdoms into one Germany, okay? And not only did he unite Germany, but he also wanted to protect Germany, especially from France. He really disliked France because of what Napoleon had done, right? Napoleon, just about 50 years earlier, had tried to take over all of Europe twice. Like, anyway, so Germany, after it was unified, he wanted to protect Germany from France, but also from any other nation. And so he organized a big string of alliances to kind of put everyone in check so that there wouldn't be any war. And so Germany signed and became an allied with Austria-Hungary and also down here with Italy. He also would sign agreements with Russia and with Britain. He just this big spider web of alliances to keep everyone connected so no one would go to war with each other. And this worked out pretty nicely, except for in 1914 when one little regional conflict, because of that big web of alliances, pulled everyone into conflict. Kind of a tragic historical irony how what was meant to prevent war ended up causing an enormously unnecessary and horrific war. And this happened when the Austria-Hungarian Duke Ferdinand, or this guy right here, he was down in this city right here, Sarajevo. And at this time, there was lots of Bosnians, right? This is currently Bosnia. This is where Bosnia is, right? Lots of Bosnians who wanted to be part of Serbia, who didn't want to be part of this empire anymore. And so there's a lot of unrest right here, right? He was down there visiting, and a Bosnian national shot him, okay? And this infuriated Austria-Hungary, right? And they declared war on Serbia. Now, that's where it should have just ended. It should have just been one of the other many little Balkan conflicts, right? But what happened was Serbia was allied with Russia, okay? So when Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia declared war on Austria. Well, remember, Germany was Austria's ally. So Germany declared war on Russia. Well, France was Russia's ally. So France declared war on Germany. And suddenly, one little conflict that started down right here pulled these huge, very powerful industrial nations to war with each other. It really, I don't think anyone realized how awful this was going to be. Okay. Now, let's look at this map right here. If you are Germany and World War I has just started, okay, what immediate problems do you see? You're right here, your allies are right here, your enemies are right here and right here. You are fighting a two-front war, which is something you never ever want to do. It's really, really bad because if you start to invade one, the other can invade out your back door and vice versa. You're completely surrounded. Okay. So, what do? You have two fronts. How do you solve this problem? And the answer is you got to take one of them out as quick as possible, right? Because you're going to be using up a lot of resources, a lot of manpower guarding both borders. The best way would be to get one to surrender right off the bat so that you can focus all your resources on fighting on the other front. So you've got France and you've got Russia. Which one do you take out first? In order to answer that question, it's useful to know where the capitals of both of these are. France, the capital is right here in Paris, okay? Russia, the capital's clearing the crap over here in Moscow. If the Germans were going to capitulate Russia, they would have to invade 1,000 miles into Russian territory to conquer Moscow. And that would be extremely difficult. You'd stretch out your supply lines, stretch out your manpower. Because your troops would go a lot faster than your supply chains could keep up with. You'd get spread out really quick. You'd be super weak. Really bad option to invade Russia. And that's exactly what Hitler did and why he lost. It's what Napoleon did and he lost. If you're ever going to try to take over Europe, don't invade Russia, especially during the winter. Okay. Anyway, so Russia's out. So they decided to turn to France. And that's exactly what they did. They were going to do a quick hit on Paris right here. They were going to march through Belgium. They did that. And that's what pulled Britain into World War I because Britain and Belgium were allies. So now that created an even bigger problem because Britain, right here, has the most powerful navy in the world ever since Horatio Nelson defeated Napoleon at Trafalgar, right? British have ruled the seas. And so now Germany is really surrounded because you've got Russia, France, and then Britain is right here controlling all the oceans, right? Right here as well, and right here. And so Germany made a very strong strike against France. But the problem is, remember that these are industrialized nations. They have railroads scattered everywhere. And France was able to get a whole bunch of troops up to northern France to stop the invasion really quick. Okay. Before, for hundreds and hundreds of years, whenever two countries or two kingdoms or two nobles went to war with each other, it usually took a long time to build up the armies. You had to go recruiting, you had to train them, you had to get them all ready, and then you usually met out in some field to go slug it out. And it usually gave the opponents, right, the two kingdoms that were going to go to war with each other, enough time to negotiate, to talk things out, to try to find a solution. That didn't happen in World War One. Whereas it took months to get ready for war here, it took a matter of days to get ready right here. And so France was able to pump all these troops, all these tanks, all these machines, right, up to northern France, able to build all these trenches to stop the Germans. So the Germans in their invasion were stopped dead in their tracks, and they slugged it out for the next 3 years, right, from 1914 to 1917. Brutal slugfest right here. Hardly an inch of ground was gained. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost right here along the French Belgium borders where most of the bloodshed was, which is super ironic because the whole conflict started right here on the opposite end of Europe. And yet, this is where most of the life was lost. Really terrible. And so, Russia had their revolution in 1917, so they were knocked out of the picture pretty quick. They didn't do much anyway. I mean, there's a couple battles, but most of the fighting was right here. The German Navy was blockaded by Britain. Britain was able to put a blockade right here in the English Channel, as well as right here between Scotland and Norway. And they were able to keep Germans from trading. So, right off the bat, as soon as World War I started, Germany was cut off from the rest of the world, cut off from its colonies, cut off from its allies, and it was starting to starve, right? It was running out of fuel, running out of food, running out of resources, okay? And so it was doing really bad. And so Germany decided it was going to start using its subs to start taking out as many British ships as possible, especially the merchant trading ships. They were hoping that since its economy was tanking and it was starving, they could make Britain suffer a little too economically. And so they started hitting passenger ships and merchant ships, ships that weren't even military ships, they were civilian ships. And one of those ships was a Lusitania, which held American passengers, which brought the United States into the war. And with the entrance of America into the war, Germany was really hosed and surrendered on November 11th, 1917, after a really brutal, horrible war that was pretty pointless. Like Germany, France, Britain, Russia, all these guys went to war because these two dinky little countries right here went to war. Like completely pointless. And yet it was so awful. So many lives were lost. It was terrible. So, why do we care about World War One? Well, what happened after World War One directly led to World War Two, mostly because of this Treaty of Versailles. This was signed at Versailles, right out of Paris, and it basically blamed Germany for everything, which is super sad because Germany didn't even start it, right? It was one of their allies, but they made Germany pay for all the reparations, right? All the damages, which cost about $5 billion, tons and tons of money they needed to pay. It actually ended up sending Germany into a major depression. Okay. Empires were broken up. The Austria-Hungarian Empire was broken up into Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, um, Romania, right, broken up. The Russian Empire also fell and became the USSR. And it was just an awful, awful war. It was the first time that industrialized nations went to war with each other, meaning that the industries, the factories, the shipyards, right? Things that in the past had never been touched by war were now the suppliers of war. And so when bombers and tanks went, they were taking out factories and civilians because the whole nation was geared toward the war effort. It was really horrific, right? And that's why we care about World War One, is because of the way Germany was treated, the reason why it was beaten down so much, right? France especially blamed Germany for everything and hated Germany and made Germany pay. Because of the financial and political instability of Germany, it allowed a certain National Socialist named Adolf Hitler to rise to power. And just 25 years, within 25 years after World War One, the world entered World War Two. And World War Two has completely changed the world. So that's a very brief overview of the forces that caused World War One, how it went, and why we should care.